In 1995, Nevada rancher A.G. Smith found a way to save his ranch. Smith was dealing with a problem that many American ranchers face: desolate public land due to overgrazing by cows. So Smith got an experimental permit from the Forestry Service to practice something called regenerative grazing, an innovative ranching technique that works with cows to protect and rejuvenate the land. But in 2016, the Forestry Service took away Smith's experimental permit, barring him from practicing regenerative grazing and forcing him to continue the traditional practices that are currently degrading 840 million acres of land in the United States. So, in order to change our overgrazing crisis, let's first start by taking a look at the public land problem, then its causes, before finally observing some solutions for the problem that agricultural science scholar Dr. J. Boone Kaufman says is accelerating the impact of climate change. Now, let's take a step back, because most of you have probably heard that our agricultural climate impact comes from cows. That is not universally true, and we'll take a look at exactly why that is as we observe the real problem: historic overgrazing and its community impacts. First, grazing takes place on public land. Think about being on a road trip and seeing cows on a mountain or across the plains. That is public land used by ranchers for grazing. Current grazing practices are non-regenerative, meaning they don't give the land time to recover. A good way to think about this is to imagine what would happen if you walked over a flower bed once. Some plants might be smushed, but if 30 cows for 30 years walked over that flower bed, the land would no longer be able to survive. That is called overgrazing, which according to the Bureau of Land Management, or BLM, is the biggest cause of land health failure in the West. We are all affected by public land health, whether or not we feel it, because it is directly tied to emissions. Healthy land stores carbon. When that land is degraded, carbon is released. MIT News in 2024 found that the total carbon released from overgrazed public land amounts to 4 years' worth of all the world's fossil fuel emissions combined. This, coupled with the fact that the advocacy group Public Employees for Environmental Responsibility found that nearly 60 million acres of public land is currently failing health standards, shows that public land degradation is a climate warming crisis. But on top of its climate impact, there's a key human impact, bringing us to our second problem: community erasure. With current non-regenerative grazing practices, ranchers are left with little ability to progress forward. Right now, ranchers basically have two choices. One, to stop grazing entirely, effectively causing them to close their ranches, removing access to economic advancement, security, and a profession that's been in their family for generations. Or two, to keep grazing as is, destroying land that they rely on, causing grave economic harm, and, in the long run, effectively causing them to close their ranches. In both these scenarios, ranchers are left without autonomy. On top of this, many environmentalists advocate for what can only be described as community erasure. People see the harm created by ranchers, cows, and grazing, and assume that our path forward has to happen without them. When ranchers are limited in autonomy due to public land degradation and met with messaging that advocates for their erasure, we see just one part of why the National Rural Health Association in 2023 found that farmers and ranchers are 3.5 times more likely to die by suicide than their counterparts in other professions. With the dire environmental and community impacts, we're left asking, why can't we protect public land and protect the agricultural community? Because of restrictive grazing permits and public opinion. First, ranchers have access to graze on public land via permits issued by bureaus, BLM, and the Forestry Service. These permits are why the land is becoming so degraded. A permit for grazing on public land has the following information for the rancher: the boundary of land their cows can be on, the days to take the cows off, and the exact number of cows that can be on the land. And that's it. The problem with this is multifaceted. First, the permits lack guidelines and education that encourage ranchers to practice regenerative grazing. Second, ranchers cannot graze regeneratively, even if they intend to. Correct weather conditions are essential for regenerative grazing, but with permits that dictate days exactly, ranchers cannot respond to weather changes. It's cold right now in April and May, and getting warmer in October and November. But these permits assume that the weather is the same every single day of the year, and that the land is the same this year as it was last year, offering ranchers no flexibility in how they graze and offering them little empowerment to graze better. If a rancher wants their permit to change based on weather conditions today, they have to go through a National Environmental Policy Act process. The national average for the time this takes? 8 years for just one permit to change. In order to speed up this process, greater shifts have to happen in how this land is managed. But for that to happen, public opinion needs to change. Many environmentalists default to the belief that cows are bad, a sentiment which often removes cattle grazing and erases communities. But they don't have to. While it is true that grazing can be bad for the environment, it is not true that it always is. What is bad for the environment is the archaic policies that prevent regenerative grazing. This is one of many places where we have shut down progress due to dominant discourses that are no longer, or may have never been, true. When organizations like the Western Watersheds Project, for example, advocate that we must protect land from the dangerous effects of livestock grazing, perpetuating that land is a victim, while livestock are some kind of villain, we lose sight of the fact that both work together. And they have to if we want a sustainable future. This issue is not black and white, cows versus the environment, cowboys versus hippies. But when this kind of dominant discourse is set in stone, it is difficult to change. It ostracizes ranchers from conversations about their own profession and prevents regenerative grazing when all parties involved want the same thing: to protect the land. So, in order to protect public land and the ranchers who graze on it, we need regenerative grazing. To do that, we need permitting changes and community education. First, regenerative grazing is the technique that A.G. Smith used to save his ranch. It's a holistic form of management described by the Pasture Project as a type of agriculture which aims to protect and rejuvenate agricultural landscapes and communities, not degrade or merely sustain them. Regenerative grazing strategically places cows on the land when it's best for grazing and systematically moves them to let the land recover. Information on regenerative grazing is accessible at this website I created. Next, in order for regenerative grazing, ranchers need more flexibility regarding when and where cows can graze on public land. The language and permitting needs to change. Linked here, you can access a letter to your representatives that encourages them to advocate for a change in permitting language, to increase flexibility, accommodate ranchers' needs, and encourage regenerative grazing. It also asks them to support federal funding for regenerative practices as outlined by Regenerate America. Regenerate America advocates for a change in the Farm Bill to support regenerative practices. And on their website, linked here, you can sign their petition. Finally, community education can help mitigate the harm of inaccurate public opinion. But for that to work, we need to be open to the idea that the best facts come from listening to multiple voices. You might have come in today with the belief that cows are bad, or maybe even relied on it as fact, without engaging with the agricultural community or voices that has the experience to say that's not true. It's our job to educate ourselves and share that education, but it's not our job to be an advocate for or against things that we simply don't understand. That's when we listen and learn. Use this educational space to your advantage. Linked here, you can access beginner's guides and advocacy tools made for ranchers, created by the Pasture Project and the Regenerative Agricultural Idea Network. Share these resources with ranchers and members of your community to prioritize enhancing education as we move towards a future where our public lands can thrive. Today, we took a look at the overgrazing crisis, its causes in permitting and public opinion, and finally observed our solution: regenerative grazing, permitting changes, and community education. Let's live in a world where cows can be good for the environment, and ranchers are empowered to make decisions about their own cows, so that people like A.G. Smith can protect public land for all of us.